Okay, the reading for this week is Tayama Katai's Shōjobyō, 1907. It was published, translated by Kenneth Henshall as The Girl Watcher. And this is Tayama Katai, of course, is most famous for his novel Futon, which was also published the same year, 1907. And this year, this Futon, or the quilt, it's translated as Futon, is often regarded as the sort of beginning of the Watashi Shōsetsu mode of literature or genre. Some people say that it's not a literary genre, that it's actually just a mode of reading, but we can discuss that later in class. But Tayama Katai is mostly associated with the Watashi Shōsetsu, the I novel, which is a major sort of mode of discourse or mode of literary creation that begins around this time, 1907, at the end of the Meiji period, late Meiji period. Tayama Katai, just very briefly, I'm going to introduce him, then go over some of the literary terms that are relevant, and then the study questions, and then I will turn the microphone over to Nicole, and she will do the recitation of the work, and we will discuss this in detail in class. As always, you will have the English translation as well as the Japanese original in class. Tayama Katai, The Girl Watcher, original Shōjobyō, May 1907, published in the popular magazine of the late Meiji period, Taishō, or The Sun translation. I'll put the link to Kenneth Henshall's translation from 1981 in the description below, so you can purchase and read all of Tayama's very important works in the context of late Shizen Shugi. As we discussed in a previous class, there are Shizen Shugi, or naturalism in Japan, is often divided into two stages: the Zenki Shizen Shugi, or early naturalism, and late naturalism, Koki Shizen Shugi. Early naturalism is associated with Zola, kind of the faithful or objective or scientific reproduction of society, of social norms and social conditions and so forth, being the fundamental and primary aim of art. That's Zenki Shizen Shugi. And this is followed, it's sort of morphed into late naturalism, or Koki Shizen Shugi, which turned the focus away from society at large and onto the self. And this Koki Shizen Shugi is usually used synonymously with an I novel, the Watashi Shōsetsu. Tayama Katai, born 1872, died in 1930. Ken Yusha writer originally, so he was associated with this Bundan group, which was the center of the Bundan in the Meiji period in the 1890s. It lasted about 10-12 years, I think, founded by Ozaki Koyo and others, and it was the first sort of purely literary coterie or literary group of modern Japan. Tayama Katai began his career associated with his Ken Yusha writers, even though his style was very different. And later he moved in the direction of naturalist novels, late naturalism, and he is often credited, as I mentioned, with writing the first Watashi Shōsetsu, namely Futon, although this work can be considered as the first Watashi Shōsetsu as well. His early work was highly romantic in the beginning with the Ken Yusha writers, but with the essay Dokotsu Nara Byōsha in 1904, Dokotsu Nara Byōsha is a key term, we'll discuss below. This essay is English translation, Straightforward Description, 1904. With this sort of manifesto essay that he wrote, he moved in a very different direction, namely toward a more realistic path and to follow the French influence. The injunction to observe strict objectivity and to describe things as they are, ari no mama, as you say in Japanese, deriving from the early French naturalists such as Guy de Maupassant and the brothers Edmond and Jules Goncourt, developed into a major genre in Japanese literature, namely the Watashi Shōsetsu, or autobiographical novel, it might be translated, or the Ich-Roman. The Watashi Shōsetsu, I think the name that originally comes from the German word Ich-Roman. His Onna no Kyoshi was published in 1903, but Futon, 1907, made his reputation. This is the work that's most often read today, Futon. Futon describes in embarrassing detail the attraction of a middle-aged writer to a young female student, and they have this kind of weird relationship. A trilogy of autobiographical novels followed, namely Sei, with the kanji for life, 1908, Tsuma, or Wives, 1908-9, En, which is translated The Bond, fixed the distinguishing form of Japanese naturalism. Inaka Kyoshi, in 1909, the country schoolmaster, showed the influence of the Golden Courts and of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Tayama's essay on his own literary theories, Katai Bunwa, or Katai's literary discourses, introduced into the critical language the term heimen byōsha, or plain description, which I'll explain in a second, with which he is identified. So whenever you see him discussed in literary histories of modern Japan, written by Japanese writers, they often mention this term that he coined called Heimen Byōsha. In later years, with the decline in the influence of naturalism, he entered a period of personal confusion, from which he emerged with a calm, almost religious attitude, which is reflected in his later work from 1918 called Zansetsu, or Lingering Snow. Alright, that introduction is adapted from several encyclopedia sources. I'll put information about that below. And now the three literary terms that you need to keep in mind as you read this. First is Heimen Byōsha, this important term with which he is identified. It's translated as plain description, flat description, objective description, surface description, or unmediated description might be a good way to put it. Tayama's guiding aesthetic concept and key to his technique of sketch from life realism. Sketch from life, of course, is shasei. In Japanese, sei o utsusu is the kanji for that, an important aesthetic term. From the Meiji period, often associated with Masaoka Shiki and his poetry that sought to do away with all the referentiality and intertextuality and parody and allusions and so forth that had characterized early modern and pre-modern Japanese poetry, and moved just to a direct confrontation with the natural phenomena as they exist. And that was called shaseibun, and Tayama Katai took that idea of shaseibun and kind of applied it to prose rather than poetry. And this notion of Heimen Byōsha focuses on the surface of things, with as little thoughts and feelings and imagination and subjectivity and subjective evaluation and so forth as possible. Whether he actually, this is what he intended to do in his writings, whether he actually accomplishes that is something we can discuss after reading this work and some other works by Tayama Katai. His radically empiricistic motto was, I describe my own experiences in reality only as I saw, heard, and touched them. Alright, the second term you need to know, of course, is Watashi Shōsetsu, the I novel, ich roman, form or genre, some say it's not a form or genre, we discuss that later, of 20th century Japanese literature. It's also a mode of reading characterized by self-revelation and a focus on personal matters, thus the word watashi, which doesn't necessarily mean I. Watashi just means private, really. In Chinese, classical Chinese, it means private. Shiteki, as we say in the onyomi reading, it means that which is has to do with the private, right? Focus on personal or private matters from a subjective perspective. The author of Watashi Shōsetsu is usually the central character in the work, or readers at least read the main character of the work as a sort of direct representation of the author, him or herself. And this mode of writing and reading emphasizes flat, unvarnished, and sincere depiction, not a lot of jokes, not a lot of parody, not a lot of allusions to other literary works. And it grows, as I mentioned earlier, as at the top of this video, it grows out of the naturalist movement, namely the early phase of the naturalist movement. Tayama's Katai is often regarded as the first. The term, however, this is an important point, nobody started using this word Watashi Shōsetsu immediately after Tayama Katai wrote Futon. The discourse, or the gensetsu, the Watashi Shōsetsu gensetsu, the discourse of the I novel didn't appear until the 1920s, when literary critics started writing about it and kind of theorizing about it, looking back at these novels that had been written from 1907 onward. Hiro Ken famously divided the I novel into two types, the Hametsugata and the Chōwa-gata. So the sort of more destructive type and the more harmonious type. Or you can kind of convert these ideas into the Dionysian type and the Apollonian type, you might say. Alright, number three, third word you need to know is, of course, Genbun Ichi, which we've talked about many times. This is the principle of unifying the spoken, the geng, and the written, the bun, into one style of writing. Right? So this is the modern Japanese colloquial way of writing novels, writing prose, writing newspaper articles, writing history textbooks, and pretty much everything. Right? So this is the modern colloquial style that's often regarded as transparent, first advocated in the 1880s, and then it slowly picked up from there, first successfully achieved in the works of Futabate Shime and Yamada Bimyo, and it became the style, Genbun Ichi style, became the dominant mode of writing after 1895. By 1910, the principle or style had become so widespread the term was no longer used. So pretty much after 1910, everyone is writing in this style, even if they occasionally dip into the past and try to revive as a kind of experiment older styles in certain passages of the work. The works as a whole are predominantly written in Genbun Ichi after 1910. And this work, although written before 1910, it's written in Genbun Ichi, as we will see. Alright, that's the introduction. Number, how many? We have 8 questions on the study guide, very briefly. Number 1. These are the questions you will want to consider as you read the work. From what point of view is the story told? Is it first person or third person point of view? Where is this focalization point? Underline these 2 important literary words. Point of view, shiten, and focalization point, shoten, as you say in Japanese. Where is the focalization point? So remember, in third person narratives, the focalization point often goes into one of the characters' minds or hearts or whatever, but not all of them. Where is the focalization point of this narrator? Give examples. Number 2, describe the style of prose. Is this an example of what Tayama Katai called heimen byōsha? If so, how is it an example of that? Is it an example of Genbun Ichi, the vernacular modern style? Explain. And the way to tell, of course, is Genbun Ichi is written at the end of sentences. You'll see da or de aru rather than nari or other classical what's the word I'm looking for? Katsuyo verb endings and so forth. Number 3, describe the setting or the surrounding and the surrounding scenery. What sort of area was Sendagaya, which is where the story takes place, in the early 20th century? Is this the center of Tokyo? Is it a kind of a suburb way out in the outskirts of the city, beyond the city? Explain the sort of atmosphere and the meaning of this area, Sendagaya, and this place where he lives, the sort of class status of it and so forth. Number 4, describe Sugita Kojo, is the main character of the work. His age, his appearance, his personality, his job, workplace, his interests, his dreams, his literary experience, his domestic situation, his type in woman, which means, what does that mean? It's the things, the qualities that he likes in women, anguish, the source of his anguish, his reputation among his colleagues, his henrekisho, as we say in Japanese, his sexual or romantic history with women, his what he calls himself his illness or his condition, Shōjobyō is a title in Japanese, byo meaning sickness or illness or condition. Is he a comic figure, a tragic figure, or a tragicomic figure? Consider those. Number 5, describe the final scene. Might his death have been intentional? So this can this be read as a case in suicide? Explain. Number 6, make a list of all the girls, the shoujo, that appear in the story. Describe their features. What do they all have in common? Number 7, is Sugita aware of how he is viewed by others? Is he keiwai, as we say in Japanese, or kuki yomenai hito, somebody who cannot read the air and cannot sort of gauge what others are thinking about him? Or is he aware of what they think about him and just doesn't really care? Does he care what others think about him? How does the author, Tayama Katai himself, employ ironic distance and dramatic irony in the work, which is a very important question. So even though Tayama Katai is regarded as the sort of father of the Watashi Shōsetsu, keep in mind that he understands the distance between himself as a human, Tayama Katai, and the character that he's creating and performing and putting into the work. Right? Just in yesterday's seminar class, we read some works by Dazai Osamu, who does kind of the same things. He plays with the reader's expectations that they will read this character as a direct representation of himself, knowing that there's a distance between the two and a distinction between the two, and that is kind of affords an opportunity to create humor and ironic distance and dramatic irony and so forth. Consider that in question number 7. And finally, question number 8, Tayama Katai is often regarded as the first ai novelist, as I mentioned above, Watashi Shōsetsuka. Can you identify any Watashi Shōsetsu teki yoso, ai novel-esque features in this work? Explain. Alright, so those are the 8 questions that you want to keep in mind as you read and listen to this work, and we will go over answers to all of those and perhaps other issues in class. And for those interested in Tayama Katai, there's also a good study in English called A Literary Life in Tokyo that includes his translations of his own memoirs of his 30 years in Tokyo. Alright, which is also translated by Henshall. So Kenneth Henshall, I think he's a British guy. He did a lot of work on Tayama Katai in English, which is very valuable. Alright, now I shall turn over the microphone to Nicole, and she will read the work. It's 8 pages in your PDF file with 2 pages on each page, really. So 16 pages total, and so it should take about 30-40 minutes. That is all for me. Goodbye bye.
The Girl Watcher by Tayama Katai. 1. As the 7:20 a.m. Yamanote Line train passes through Yoyogi Station on its way to the city, shaking the embankment, a man walks on his way between the paddies in nearby Sendagaya. He goes the same way every morning, whatever the weather. Rainy days find him plowing his way through the mud in his old waterproof boots, while on windy days he has his hat clamped on the back of his head, warding off the dust. The people living along the way spot him coming, and one woman even wakes up her husband, a military official prone to sleep late on drowsy spring mornings, by telling him he'll be late for the office as that man has just gone past. He had first appeared on the scene some 2 months earlier. It was a time of suburban development, and new properties would appear on top of a hill or at the edge of a wood, with the huge mansions of major generals and company directors scattered picturesquely amongst the rows of charcoal oaks that were spared from the development of the area. Rumor had it that beyond these oaks, half a dozen or so houses had been built to let, and that the man had probably moved into one of these. Somebody passing by is not usually anything to start talking about, but in the lonely countryside, people are something of a rarity, and this particular man's figure was, moreover, decidedly peculiar. He walked in a strange, duck-like fashion, and there was just something odd about him which caught the attention of the people leisurely living along the way. He was about 37, with rounded shoulders, a pug nose, protruding teeth, and a swarthy complexion, and tangled sideburns that covered half his face. He was quite fearsome to look at, enough to upset young ladies even in broad daylight. But, in contrast, he had something kind and gentle about his eyes, which always seemed as if entranced by something. His legs set determinedly wide apart, he would scurry along at an amazing pace, even putting to shame a certain soldier who went out training every morning. He mostly wore Western-style clothes, an old brown suit of threadbare Scotch wool, and an Inverness cape faded to a dull, purplish yellow. In his right hand he carried a walking stick with an easy-grip dog's head handle, and while he kept his left hand in his pocket, with an ill-becoming maroon cloth bundle clasped under his arm. "He's off now, then, I see," mumbled the gardener's wife to herself as he passed by their trellis fence on the corner. The gardener's place was also a newly built detached, with the spindly pines, oaks, box trees, 8-finger trees, and so on that were for sale planted untidily around outside. Beyond it, along the highway, lay the broken skyline of Sendaga's new residential area, with the rays of the morning sun glittering on the upstairs windows. To the left lay the numerous factories of Tsunohazu, with the smoke of the morning's work already underway, coiling low and thick from the narrow flues. In the otherwise clear sky he could make out the tops of telegraph poles above the woods. He walked on his way. Crossing the paddies, he entered a narrow pebbly lane with neat rows of brushwood fences, oak hedges and hawthorn hedges, punctuated by glass doors, cross-barred gates, and gas lamps. Some gardens still had ropes fastened to the trees to prevent frost damage. A few blocks further on he came to Sendagaya Road, where he invariably encountered the soldier racing along on his exercise. He continued past a foreigner's large Western-style house, the huge gate of a doctor's new house, and an old thatched cottage that sold cheap confectionery. Now he could see the raised track of Yoyogi Station, and from here he could usually hear the train whistle from Shinjuku, the next station, which would prompt him to forget any semblance of dignity and race ahead at full tilt, bulky as he was. Today, as usual, he arrived at the spot and listened, but could not hear the train coming, and so continued at his same brisk pace. However, turning the corner at T-junction with the track, he caught sight ahead of him of an attractive woman with a fashionable hairstyle and a smart purple coat, a green ribbon, satin sandal straps, crisp white socks. The sight made his heart race. He couldn't put it into words, but it just seemed to feel, in a happy, flustered sort of way, that it would be a pity to overtake her. He already knew the woman by sight, and they had traveled in the same train carriage at least 5 or 6 times. In fact, one wintry evening he had deliberately made a detour to see where she lived, a large house to the west of the Sendagaya paddies, surrounded by oaks. He knew she was the eldest daughter of a family. She had beautiful eyebrows, a pale complexion, and plump cheeks, and when she laughed her eyes were expressive beyond words. He enjoyed thinking about her. She's in her early 20s, so she can't be going to school. I know that anyway, since I don't see her every day. But I wonder where she does go, then. He was terribly excited by the beautiful figure ahead of him. I wonder if she's engaged yet. This thought, however, caused him a twinge of sadness. If only I were a bit younger. But then his thoughts changed again. How absurd! I'm not only too old, I have a wife and children as well. He was left feeling somehow sad, somehow happy. As it happened, he did overtake her at the steps up to Yoyogi Station. The rustling of her clothes and the fragrance of her perfume made his heart miss a beat, but he refrained from turning around and raced up the steps with giant strides, almost at a gallop. The station master clipped his red return ticket and gave it back to him. Like all the station officials, he was now quite accustomed to the man's bustling, fast-talking manner. As he was about to enter the wooden waiting room, the man's sharp eyes caught sight of the familiar figure of a girl student standing there. She was a sweet-looking girl, with plumpish features and rosy cheeks. She wore a bright, striped top and a maroon hakama. She carried a slender parasol in her right hand, and a bundle wrapped in purple cloth in her left. He noticed straight away that her ribbon today was white, different from her usual one. Surely she can't have forgotten me, not this girl. He looked towards her, but she was facing away with a blank expression. She's probably just shy, he thought, and this somehow seemed to endear her to him. He pretended not to look, but in fact did so frequently and intently. And then, looking away, his gaze now fixed on the woman he had just overtaken at the steps. He hardly seemed aware of the train's arrival. 2. There was a reason for his thinking that the girl might not have forgotten him, for a rather interesting incident had taken place. She had always got on the train at Yoyogi at the same time as he did, to go as far as Ushigome, so he had known her by sight for some time. But even so, he had never gone so far as to speak to her. He would just sit opposite her, thinking about what a plump girl she was, how fleshy her cheeks were, how big her breasts were, and what a wonderful girl she was. As the days passed, he came to notice all sorts of things about her, such as how beautiful her smile was, how she had a little mole just below her ear, how white her slender arms were as she clung to the straps in the crowded carriage, and how she talked saucy girl talk with some school friends who joined her at Shinanomachi. It got to the point where he wanted to find out about her home and family. But for all that, he didn't seem prepared to go quite as far as to follow her to find these things out. Then, one day, as he was coming out into the paddies of Sendagaya, in his same old way, along his same old route, with his same old hat and his same old Iverness cape, and his same old suit, and his same old shoes, he suddenly saw, walking towards him, that very same plumpish girl. She was wearing a white top fastened loosely over her jacket, was smoothing her hair with one hand, and was chattering about something with a girlfriend. Whenever we meet a familiar face in an unfamiliar setting, we always seem to feel a sort of friendship, and this is what he too seemed to feel. He suddenly slowed, as if intending to say hello. The girl also glanced towards him, as if she were thinking, "Ah, it's that man from the train." However, she passed without a word. He spoke out instinctively, but to himself. "No school today, then?" "Exam leave, perhaps, or spring holidays." He hurried on a dozen or so yards without thinking, and suddenly spotted, quietly fallen there on the blank, soft, beautiful spring soil, and looking just like a silver pine needle on a gilded screen, an aluminum hairpin. It was hers. He turned around quickly and called to her. "I say, hey! I say!" She'd only gone a few dozen paces, so she undoubtedly heard him. But, not thinking that it was she herself that he was calling, she carried on walking and chatted with her friend, not even looking round. The morning sun shone beautifully on the blade of a farm worker's plow spade out in the fields. "I say! Hey! I say!" he called out again as if reciting a verse. This time the girl did turn round. She saw him looking towards her in a strange pose with his hands up in the air. With a sudden realization, she clasped her hand to her hair. The pin was gone. "What? Heavens, I've dropped my hairpin!" she exclaimed, and dashed off towards him. He waited, holding the pin, hands still held high. She panted as she ran. "Thank you very much." She thanked him, blushing with embarrassment. A grin spread over his big, square-cut face, revealing his obvious delight as he returned the pin to her beautiful white hand. "Thank you very much indeed." She thanked him again politely, and then turned on her heels. He was deliriously happy. It was simply marvelous. From now on, she'll remember me. From now on, when we meet in the train, she'll think of me as the man who picked up her hairpin for her. His thoughts rambled. If I were a little younger, and if she were just a little prettier, then there'd have been an interesting tale to tell about this episode. One thought gave rise to another. He had idly wasted away his youth. His wife, whom he'd once loved, had passed her prime. He had children. His life was bleak. He was behind the times, with no hope for the future. Such thoughts were tangled and twirled, almost without end. Then suddenly, into the midst of this revere floated the sullen face of the editor-in-chief of the magazine house where he worked, at which, hastily abandoning his daydreams, he hurried on along the lane. 3. We might as well wonder where this man comes from. Across the paddies of Sendagaya, beyond the rows of charcoal oats, through the area lined with the gates of the splendid new mansions, past a meadow with lowing cows, along a little path by the rows of great oaks, and beyond that, down in the shadow of a gently sloping hill, you find a small detached house, and it is from here that he emerges every morning. Its appearance, low roof, 3 rooms, surrounded by a low hawthorn hedge, tells you that it is a crudely built rented house. The garden and parlor can be fully seen from the road without having to go in through the little gate. And in the garden, down at the foot of 5 or 6 dwarf bamboos, several small daphnes are in bloom, with half a dozen or so potted plants laid out untidily nearby. A woman in her mid-20s, clearly his wife, is busily at work with her sleeves tied up out of the way. A boy of about 4 and a girl of about 6 have come out into the sunny veranda of the room next to the parlor and are happily playing and chattering away. On the south side of the house is a well with an upturned bucket, and, around 10 o'clock and weather permitting, his wife takes the tub out there and busily sets about the washing. You can hear the peaceful splashing, watery sound of clothes being washed, while a nearby white lotus, sparkling beautifully in the spring sunlight, spreads an aura of indescribable serenity. Naturally, his wife is now somewhat faded, but even so she gives the impression that in her day she was better looking than average. She has her hair done up in a rather old-fashioned pile, with her puffy front locks taken up. She wears a striped cotton kimono, the ends of her maroon waist sash hanging to the ground, and, as she busies her hands with the washing, her sash bustle moves delicately. Presently her young boy comes up to her, calling, "Mama, Mama!" And no sooner does he reach her than he gropes for her breast. "Now just wait," she says, but the child pays not the least attention, and so, hastily drying her wet hands on her apron, she sits down on the front veranda and takes the child in her arms. The girl also comes along and stands there. The study, which doubles as the guest room, is a 6-mat room with a small, glass-fitted Western-style bookcase set up against the west wall, and a chestnut desk against the opposite wall. A bowl of spring orchids stands in the alcove, and the scroll there is a reproduction of a landscape by Buncho. The spring sunlight comes into the room, and it all seems very warm and pleasant. There are 2 or 3 magazines on the desk. The yellow wood graining of a Noshido lacquered inkstone case stands out quite noticeably, and some paper, probably copy paper from his company, flutters in the spring breeze. The hero of the piece is named Sugita Kojo, and it goes without saying that he is a literary man. When he was younger, his name had achieved a benefiting degree of prominence, and 2 or 3 of his works had even been quite well received. Indeed, neither he himself nor anyone else had thought that at his present age of 37, he would have come to be employed in an insignificant magazine house, commuting day after day and even doing trivial tasks such as proofreading magazines, nor that he would have sunk banally below the horizon of the literary world. But there was a reason for this course of events. He had been the same for years, actually, but he had this bad habit of getting obsessed with young women. Every time he saw a beautiful young woman, his otherwise quite sharp powers of observation lost all discrimination. When he was younger, he wrote a great number of so-called girl novels, and for a time quite captured the youth of the day. But for how long could such novels, devoid of proper observation and ideology, be expected to hold people's interests? Finally, he and his thing about girls became the laughingstock of the literary world, and his novels and other writings were all laughed down. To add to it, as had already been remarked, his features were unsurpassably uncouth, and this made things worse by the contrast which they created. With a face like that, how could he have turned out as he had? When in fact, judging from appearances, he had the looks and build of someone about to do battle with the beasts. Rumor had it that it was all doubtless a freak of nature. His friends were once discussing his case. "I don't know, I just can't make it out. Perhaps it's some sort of illness? The thing is, he does nothing but think about girls. Just thinks about how good-looking they are and nothing more. Now, if it was us, well, we wouldn't be satisfied with just thinking about them. The force of instinct would soon raise its head, wouldn't you say? Perhaps he's got something physically missing somewhere. It would be a character defect rather than a physical one. No, I don't think so. I just wonder if he wasn't too self-indulgent when he was younger." Self-indulgent? "Oh, you know what I mean. He abused himself too much. They say that if you go on with that habit for too long, then you get certain physical deficiencies, and that the physical body and the inner body don't harmonize properly." "How absurd!" Someone laughed. "But he's got children, hasn't he?" remarked someone else. "Yes, he has got children," the first speaker conceded. "But I did ask a doctor about this, and he told me that the consequences could take a number of forms. In extreme cases, there's a loss of reproductive ability, but apparently there are also lots of people who end up just like Sensei. That doctor told me all sorts of things, and I really think my diagnosis is correct." "Well, I still think it's his character." "No, look, he's ill, I tell you. He should do something to get rid of his desires, like going off to a coast or somewhere and getting some good air or something. But it's just too much to believe. If he were 18 or 19 or even in his early 20s, then what you say might well be true. But he has a wife and children and he's almost 38, isn't he? You're just giving some sort of psychological catch-all. It's just too conclusive to be true." "No, listen, it can be explained. You're saying this sort of thing can't happen once you're out of your teens. But the point is that there are any number of cases. I'm sure that Sensei is still going on with the habit even now. You see, when he was younger, he was silly enough to pretend to believe that love was pure and sacred. But whatever he might say, he couldn't fool his instincts, so finally he had to resort to self-abuse for his pleasures. Then when this instinct got to be a habit, he became ill, unable to satisfy those instincts. I'm sure that's the way it is. In other words, like I said before, his body and his inner being don't harmonize properly. But it's really interesting, isn't it? He'd pretend to be so clean living and even convince other people, but now he's ended up degraded, an example of decadence, just because he wouldn't respect his instincts. You lot are always criticizing me for believing in the force of instinct, but really, instincts are terribly important in people. You can't live unless you follow your instincts," he argued, waxing lyrical. 4. The train left Yoyogi. It was a pleasant spring morning. The sun shone gently overhead, and the air was exceptionally clear. Untidy rows of new houses in the lowland of Sendagaya and the dark rows of charcoal oats, topped by the beautiful form of Mount Fuji away in the distance, passed quickly by like a kaleidoscope. But our man, preferring the figure of a beautiful girl to the beauty of mute nature, was almost completely entranced with the faces and figures of two girls opposite him. Gazing upon living beings, however, is more troublesome than gazing upon mute nature, and so, sensing he might be discovered if he stared too openly, he was pretending to look to the side, while flashing furtive, sidelong glances at the girls. As someone once said, when it comes to girl-watching on trains, it's too direct to watch them face-on, whereas from a distance it's too conspicuous and likely to arouse people's suspicions. Therefore, the most convenient seat to occupy is one diagonally opposite, at rather an oblique angle. Being an obsessive girl-watcher, Sugita had not, of course, had to be taught the secret and had naturally discovered the technique for himself, never wasting any suitable opportunity. The expression in the elder girl's eyes was infinitely beautiful. Even the stars in the sky, he felt, lost their sparkle in comparison. Slender legs under that crepe kimono, a beautiful mauve hem, white stockinged feet in fashionable high sandals, a beautifully white neck, beautiful breasts at the swelling of her chest. It was too much for him to bear. The other, plumper girl, on the other hand, took a notebook from her pocket and began to read it with great interest. Soon they arrived at Sendagaya Station. He knew from experience that he could expect at least 3 girls to get on here. But today, for some reason, perhaps it was a little too early or a little too late, not one of those familiar 3 appeared. Instead, a plain young woman got on, the sort you normally wouldn't look twice at. So long as it was a young woman, even a rather ugly one, he would usually find some attractive feature on which to fix his gaze, such as nice eyes, a nice nose, a white complexion, pretty neck, shapely legs, or something of the sort. However, with this woman he could not, search as he might, find a single attractive point. This ghastly creature, with its protruding teeth and frizzy hair and dark complexion, promptly came and took the seat next to him. The next station, Muromachi, was a place where relatively few girls got on. He could remember that on one occasion an absolutely beautiful girl, who had all the air of being the demoiselle of a noble family, had traveled next to him as far as Ushigome, but since then he had not seen her again, to his great disappointment. He was disappointed again today. The train took on a whole crowd of gentlemen and military men and merchants and students and the like, and then sped off like some flying serpent. Coming out through the tunnel, the train started to slacken speed, and from this point he strained to get a good look at the next waiting room. Suddenly his face lit up and his heart raced. He'd spotted a ribbon he recognized. There was a girl of about 18 who got on here at Yotsuya and went to the Ochanomizu Girls' School. She was a very attractively dressed girl with particularly charming features, and so beautiful he felt there could be few equal to her even in Tokyo. She was slimly built, not at all fat but neither too skinny, her eyes sparkling clear, her mouth firm, and her cheerful face invariably flushed with a healthy crimson. Unfortunately, that day there were a lot of passengers, so she just stood there by the door. But at the conductor's request to move down inside to ease the congestion, she soon came and stood right in front of him, reaching up for the strap with her white arm. It wasn't that he didn't think about standing up to give her his seat. It was just that, if he did, then he would not only be unable to look at her white arm, it would also be very inconvenient to have to look down at her from above, and so he didn't get up. Beautiful girls in crowded trains. There was nothing he enjoyed quite so much, and he had already experienced his pleasure countless times. The feeling of soft clothing, the elusive perfumes, the touch of warm flesh. He was stirred to indescribable thoughts. In particular, the smell of female hair aroused a sort of violent desire in him, giving him inexpressible pleasure. Ichigaya, Uchinome, and Muromachi passed quickly by. The 2 girls from Yoyogi had both got off at Ushigome. The train took on a new look as it got more and more crowded. In spite of all this, he just gazed, like a man with a lost soul, in rapt admiration at the beautiful face in front of him. Presently, they arrived at Ochanomizu. 5. The magazine house where he worked, Henshall, was in Nishiki-cho at Kanda, in the very next street to the School of Proper English. In front of the glass door facing the road stood a row of some half-dozen signboards advertising the latest publications, and, going on in through that door, there was the grave face of the owner of the company, waiting at the desk of a room cluttered with magazines. The editing room was upstairs at the back, a single 10-mat room with the west and south blocked off and therefore very gloomy. There were 5 desks lined up there for the editors, and his desk was in the dark spot nearest the wall. So dark, in fact, that on rainy days he could have done with a lamp. To make things worse, the telephone was right at his side, and its incessant ringing tormented his nerves. Our hero felt thoroughly depressed as he changed into the Sotobori line at Ochanomizu, and got off at the corner of Nishikicho, Sanchome. It was as though his pleasant daydreams had been shattered, and he immediately pictured the chief editor in his own gloomy desk. Another day's agony. He went straight on to thoughts about how trying life was. He came to the gloomy conclusion, as the yellow dust of the road danced before his eyes, that the world was worth nothing. He could clearly see how mean a chore it was to proofread, and how petty it was to edit magazines. It was almost endless. If it had been that alone, however, it wouldn't have been too bad, but those beautiful visions from the train, which still lingered on and vanishing, appeared vaguely in that wretched yellow dust, making him feel that his one real pleasure in life was thus somehow being destroyed by it all, and that it was even more depressing. Into the bargain, the chief editor was a sarcastic man who thought nothing of making fun of people. Even when he, Sugita, really tried and wrote something elegant, the chief would dig in with, Sugita-kun, you've produced another love affair, I see. At the least opportunity, Sugita was mocked because of girls. Occasionally he would get angry and snap back that he wasn't a child, that he was 37, and that there was a limit even to making a fool of somebody. But his anger soon died down and he never learned. He went on writing spicy poems and composing new-style poetry. In fact, apart from gazing at the beautiful figures in the train, he liked nothing better than composing flowery, new-style poetry. And while he was at the office, whenever he had no work to attend to, he would take out some paper and write beautiful things as if his life depended on it. It goes without saying that many of his thoughts involved girls. That day, there was a lot of proofreading to be done, and our hero worked busily on it all by himself. Around 2 in the afternoon, he managed to get some of it out of the way and let out a sigh. At this point, the chief editor called out to him. Sugita-kun? Yes, he replied, looking over to the editor. I've read your latest work, you know, said the chief, laughing. Oh, really? As usual, it's beautiful. Just how do you manage to write so prettily? You know, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say you were a lady killer. There was even one reporter I remember who said how surprised he was when he actually saw how well built you are. Quite beyond what he expected, he said. Really? Is that so? Sugita could do nothing except laugh. 3 cheers for girls, eh? Chimed in one of the other editors mockingly. Sugita got angry, but considering it beneath his dignity to take up the challenge, he finally looked away. It's all so annoying. How can you understand the mentality of people who want to make fun of me, a man of 37, he thought to himself. He smoked a cigarette, unable to stand the misery of the gloomy, dismal room no matter how he tried looking at it, and the purplish-blue smoke trailed upwards in a wispy, soothing way. As he stared at it, the girl from Yoyogi, and then the girl student, and the beautiful figure from Yotsuya, and all the others appeared in mixed-up fragments and seemed to blend into one person. He realized this was a bit silly, but he didn't seem to find it unpleasant either. When it turned 3 o'clock and got closer to the time when he could leave, his thoughts turned to home. He thought about his wife. It was so useless, getting old like this. He was full of regret, to have spent his youth worthlessly and now to regret it. What use was that? It was absolutely pointless, he thought to himself again. Why hadn't he made passionate love while he was young? Why hadn't he tasted his fill of the delights of the flesh? What good was it to think of this now? He was now 37. It irritated him to think like this and made him feel like tearing his hair. He went out through the glass door. His mind was completely worn out with his day's labors, and he had a bad headache. The yellow dusk being blown away by the westerly wind was miserable, so miserable. For some reason or another, today was a particularly miserable and trying day. However much he was attracted to the fragrant scent of beautiful girls' hair, his days for loving were past. And anyway, even if he tried, he no longer had the wings to lure any beautiful bird. As he moved his bulky frame along, such thoughts made him feel life was no longer worth living. He'd be better off dead. Better off dead. Better off dead. He looked ill. His clouded eyes were a sign of his gloomy heart. It wasn't that he didn't think about his wife and children and peaceful home, it was just that such things now seemed far removed. Better off dead? If he were dead, what would his wife and children do? Even this thought now dwindled away, his spirit having sunk so low it failed to respond. Loneliness. 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 Was there no one who would save him from this loneliness? Any one of those beautiful figures from the train would do. Was there no one who would embrace him in her white arms? If only someone would, then he was sure he would be resurrected. He was sure that then he would discover life and hope and challenge and hard work. Fresh blood would flow through his veins at last. At least, that was what he believed, but in reality it was doubtful if his spirits could be revived in this way. The Sotobori train came and he got on. Straight away his sharp eyes sought for the colors of beautiful clothes, but unfortunately there was nothing on board to give him satisfaction. However, he felt more relaxed just being on the train, and from now until he got home he would be at his ease, as if in his own little paradise. The various shops and signboards along the way passed before his eyes like a kaleidoscope, and this prompted various beautiful, pleasant memories. When he came to change onto the Kobu line at Ochanomizu, he found the train almost full, due to an exhibition being held at the time. He managed to wedge himself in at the guard section, or at least he managed to position himself on the outside of the right-hand door, where he took a firm hold of the brass pole. Glancing inside the carriage, he gave a surprising start, for there, just beyond the glass window, almost overwhelmed by felt hats and college hats and Iverness capes, in fact looking just like a dove surrounded by a flock of crows, was the beautiful demoiselle from Shinanomachi, the one he had wished so much to see again. She had beautiful eyes, beautiful hands, beautiful hair. How could such a pretty girl exist in this vulgar world? Whose wife would she become? Whose arms would hold her? He was overcome with sadness and misery. It would be a fateful day, all right, when she got married, he thought. Taking advantage of the crowd of passengers and the glass between, he poured his heart, his very soul, into her beautiful figure. With her white neck, her black hair, her olive ribbon, her dainty white fingers, her gold, jeweled ring, Suidobashi, Iramachi. More and more passengers got on. When they got to Ushigome, he was on the verge of getting pushed out of the carriage. He clung to the brass pole, never taking his eyes off the girl's figure, lost to all else. At Ichigaya, another half-dozen or so passengers got on, and he pushed and shoved back in his turn, but still appeared to be right on the point of getting pushed from the carriage. The electric wires could be heard humming in the distance, and somehow everything seemed to get noisy. The whistle blew, the carriage moved forward a few yards, and then, as it suddenly gathered speed, a few nearby passengers somehow lost their balance and started to fall. The hand of the man ogling the beautiful girl came away from the brass pole, and his large frame described a perfect somersault as it tumbled, rolling onto the track, just like some large ball. "Watch out!" yelled the conductor, but at that moment a city-bound train came along, shaking the ground, and in a mere instant the big black mass was dragged slitheringly for some 10 yards or more, and a crimson trail of blood stained one of the rails. The emergency whistle rent the air with a piercing blast. May 1907.
Okay, thank you, Nicole, for the wonderful reading. As always, it was kind of a crazy story. We'll discuss it more in depth in class, along with the historical context, literary context, and so forth. I will see you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
As the 7:20 a.m. Yamanote line let's do that again. A bowl of spring. Okay, and this made things worse by the contrast which they. Oh my God! Now, if it's us, well, we wouldn't be satisfied. Let's pause for a second. Alrighty, I'm back, girlies. Trying to find out where I left off. Ooh, it scrolled down quite a bit. Alright, let's go. Lego. And got off at the corner of Nishikicho, and he immediately pictured the chief editor in his Must we? Do we? No. Let's try this one more time. Another half dozen or oh my God. Okay. His wife is in her mid-20s, and then like, oh well, she's past her prime, obviously. She's a cow, we might as well put her to death. Mid-20s? Mid-20s. You ugly ass.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.